There is a moment in every operation, and I've seen it in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the waters off Somalia, in the dark corridors of special operations planning rooms around the world, when the enemy believes they are still in control. They have their maps, they have their positions, they have their convoys moving, their ammunition flowing, their commanders issuing orders with confidence. And then, without warning, reality arrives. Not loudly, not with a declaration. Reality arrives like a precision strike in the dead of night, and by the time they understand what has happened, the entire strategic picture has already changed. What you are about to hear is that moment, unfolding right now in real time on the southern front of the most consequential land war of the 21st century. Stay with me until the end, because what is happening along the road to Crimea is not just a battlefield development. It is a masterclass in strategic patience, logistical warfare, and the kind of pressure that doesn't just bend armies, it breaks them. Let me tell you something about supply lines. In every operation I ever planned, from direct action raids to large-scale amphibious assaults, the first question was never, how do we strike the enemy? The first question was always, how does the enemy sustain itself, and how do we take that away? An army without fuel is a parking lot. An army without ammunition is a mob. An army without a secure supply corridor is a force already defeated. It just hasn't received the notification yet. The Russian military in Crimea is beginning to receive that notification. And the 600-kilometer M14 highway, the single most critical land corridor sustaining Russia's occupation of the peninsula, is now under fire. Not theoretical fire, not the fire of diplomatic pressure or economic sanctions. Real fire, drone fire, Ukrainian fire, the kind that destroys locomotives and fuel tankers and leaves generals staring at maps, wondering how their secure rear area became a combat zone. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Crimea represents, not just militarily, but psychologically, politically, and historically to Vladimir Putin. When Russia seized the peninsula in 2014, it was the crown jewel of a resurgent imperial ambition. It was the proof of concept, the demonstration that borders could be redrawn, that international law was a suggestion, and that a determined authoritarian could act faster than a democratic world could respond. Crimea became the symbol of Putin's entire strategic identity, and the M14 is the artery that keeps that symbol alive. Troops, ammunition, fuel, food, air defense systems, everything that sustains Russia's presence on the peninsula moves through that road. The Kerch Bridge exists, yes, but it has been struck before. Its capacity is limited. It is a single point of failure stretched across water, and Ukraine has made no secret of its intentions regarding that structure. Remove the M14, and the bridge becomes the last straw holding up a collapsing structure. Remove both, and Crimea becomes an island, not in geography, but in logistics. And an isolated garrison, no matter how well armed, is a garrison on a countdown. Now, here is what I need you to understand about the front in Zaporizhzhia, because this is where the story truly begins, and this is where Russia's plan began to fracture. In January and February of 2026, Russian forces launched deep infiltration attempts toward Vasilievka and Novoyakivka. Small gains, dangerous gains, the kind that look modest on a map, but carry enormous operational intent. The Kremlin's objective was to encircle Orikhiv, consolidate positions in the south, and create northward pressure toward the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. Putin's propagandists sold this to the Russian public as a successful buffer zone operation, clean, controlled, progressing on schedule. And in the short term, the numbers seem to support that narrative. Ground taken, positions held, the land bridge appearing more secure than ever. But here is what experienced commanders know that propagandists will never tell you. Tactical gains without operational sustainability are not victories. They are debts, and Ukraine was about to collect. The Ukrainian General Staff moved with the kind of disciplined precision that separates professional military organizations from political armies. They withdrew the 153rd Mechanized Brigade from Kherson and redeployed it to support the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade along the Stepove-Mali-Sherbaki axis. They directed military intelligence, special forces, their most experienced, most lethal, most adaptable operators to the critical axis around Stepnohirsk. When a military sends its best people to a particular sector, it is not a coincidence. It is a declaration of intent written in orders rather than words. And the results began to speak with absolute clarity. Since January 2026, Ukrainian forces have recaptured approximately 65 square kilometers of territory in the Zaporizhzhia direction alone. Stepnohirsk, located 25 kilometers south of the city of Zaporizhzhia, a town that Russia's elite units have been fighting over for 7 brutal months, has seen Ukrainian forces push back Russian positions in its center and northern sectors. 7 months. Russia's motorized infantry divisions, its VDV airborne units, its 11th VDV Brigade, all elements of the 58th Combined Arms Army, and additional VDV and Marine Corps forces hastily redeployed from the Donetsk front. All of this concentrated combat power. And still, Russia has failed to achieve decisive initiative. That is not a stalemate. That is a strategic failure dressed up in the language of operational patience. And the cost of that failure is now being paid in full. What comes next, however, will challenge everything you think you know about how modern wars are won and lost. Because the most decisive blow in this campaign is not being struck at the front line. It is being struck 100 kilometers behind it. I want to tell you about the operation that Ukraine kept so secret that in a brigade of over 2,000 soldiers, only approximately 10 people knew it was coming. I have planned covert operations at the highest levels of the United States military. I have sat in rooms where the number of people read into a mission could be counted on one hand. And I can tell you with the full weight of that experience, operational security of that caliber does not happen by accident. It is the product of iron discipline, extraordinary trust, and a command culture that understands that in the age of ubiquitous surveillance, secrecy itself is a weapon. Ukraine wielded that weapon with remarkable skill. The operation targeted the border region between Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk. Before a single soldier moved forward, approximately 150 Russian artillery units identified within a roughly 30-kilometer corridor between Huliaipole and Bilmak were systematically targeted. Artillery fire and drone strikes worked in precise coordination. Even the weather became an ally. Fog concealing movements, obscuring positions, giving Ukrainian forces the kind of natural cover that no electronic countermeasure can replicate. And when the infantry finally advanced, Russian commanders reportedly believed the initiative was still theirs. They had drones in the air. They had surveillance systems operating. They had the full weight of their intelligence apparatus watching the front. And still, Ukrainian assault units appeared behind their positions before Moscow understood what was happening. That moment, that gap between what an enemy sees and what an enemy understands is the decisive terrain of modern warfare. It is not measured in kilometers. It is measured in cognitive delay. And Ukraine is exploiting that delay with extraordinary effectiveness. But if you think the story ends at the front line, you are not yet seeing the full picture. Because what Ukraine is doing to the M14 and to the logistics network feeding Crimea represents a strategic ambition far larger than any single tactical success. And the pressure it is creating is beginning to register in places that generals and presidents cannot afford to ignore. Consider the fire control that Ukrainian forces have now established over sections of the Djangoi highway. Fire control does not mean physical occupation. It means making that road dangerous. It means drones hunting convoys. It means fuel tankers burning in the night. It means Russian logistics officers rerouting, delaying, consuming resources just to move what used to move freely. Every delayed truck is a subtraction. Less fuel at the front line, fewer rounds for the artillery, less flexibility for commanders who are already operating under severe constraint. The T-0509 highway, once a secure rear area, has become a zone of threat. Russian military bloggers, the same voices that once celebrated the land bridge as proof of Russia's dominance, are now openly expressing panic. They are admitting that electronic warfare systems cannot keep pace with Ukraine's drones. They are warning that railway logistics in the south may be next. And then came the night of May 5th to 6th. Ukrainian drone strikes reached Djangoi in occupied Crimea. An S-400 launcher system was struck. 2 mobile fire group vehicles destroyed. 5 Russian soldiers killed at the Djangoi train station. A locomotive destroyed. Freight cars damaged. Djangoi is not simply a train station. It is the central railway junction of Crimea, the hub through which military supplies arriving via the Kerch Bridge are distributed across the entire peninsula. Ammunition routed to Sevastopol, fuel directed to Simferopol, personnel transferred to southern coastal bases. Every train that passes through Djangoi is a thread in the logistical fabric sustaining Russia's occupation. Ukraine just pulled one of those threads, hard, and the fabric is beginning to unravel. I have spent a career studying what happens to militaries when their logistics chains come under sustained pressure. I have seen what supply disruption does to unit morale, to operational tempo, to command decision-making. It does not happen all at once. It happens the way a structure fails under load, gradually, then suddenly. Russian forces in Zaporizhzhia are already experiencing supply delays. They are being forced to deploy additional electronic warfare and air defense assets to protect every convoy, assets that cannot simultaneously be used for offensive operations. The VDV units rush from Donetsk to shore up the Zaporizhzhia line, represent resources stripped from Russia's main offensive thrust toward Pokrovsk. Weakening one front to defend another is not strategy, it is triage. And triage is what armies do when they are running out of options. There is something else happening here that goes beyond the purely military dimension, and it matters enormously for understanding where this war is heading. Putin recently began making public statements suggesting the conflict is approaching an end. His tone shifted, his rhetoric softened, at least at the margins. And I want you to think carefully about what that means. Because in my experience, when a leader who has staked his entire legacy on a military campaign begins talking about endings, it is rarely because he is winning. It is because the ground beneath him is moving and he can feel it. The Kremlin's advisor made clear that any diplomatic progress would require Ukraine to withdraw from the Donbass. In other words, to surrender through negotiation what Russia has failed to seize by force. That is not the posture of a dominant power. That is the posture of an army whose logistics chain is being strangled, whose elite units are being ground down in a town they cannot capture after 7 months of trying, and whose most prized strategic possession is being slowly, systematically isolated from the mainland that sustains it. What Ukraine is executing along the Zaporizhzhia-Crimea axis is not improvisation. It is doctrine. It is the classical art of strategic interdiction applied with 21st century tools. And what comes next in this campaign will determine not just the fate of Crimea, but the entire strategic architecture of the war. Part 2 will take you into the full depth of what that means, and why the question is no longer whether Russia can hold Crimea, but how much longer it can afford to try. There is a principle that every commander learns, sometimes in the classroom, sometimes in the field, and sometimes at the cost of lives that cannot be recovered. That principle is this: the most dangerous moment for any force is not when it is being attacked from the front. It is when it begins to doubt the security of everything behind it. When the rear is no longer safe, the psychological weight on the fighting soldier becomes something that no amount of training fully prepares you for. You are moving forward into contact, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a question forms that you cannot silence. Is the ammunition coming? Is the fuel on its way? Will the reinforcements arrive? That question, quiet, persistent, corrosive, is what Ukraine is now planting inside every Russian unit operating between Donetsk and the Black Sea coast. And once that question takes root, it does not leave. It grows, and I have watched it grow before. I know exactly what it does to an army. Let me put in precise terms what Ukraine has accomplished in the space of just a few weeks, because the scope of it demands that kind of clarity. Ukrainian unmanned systems forces conducted precision strikes across occupied Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Luhansk in early May 2026. The target list reads like a comprehensive dismantling of Russia's operational infrastructure. Pantsir and Tor air defense systems, gone. PRV-16 and P-18 radar stations, struck. Fuel and lubricant depots, burning. Ammunition storage, destroyed. Temporary deployment sites, hit before the units rotating through them could settle. Each of these targets is not simply a piece of equipment. Each one is a function. Radars allow Russia to see. Air defense systems allow Russia to protect. Fuel allows Russia to move. Ammunition allows Russia to fight. Deployment sites allow Russia to rotate, to rest, to prepare the next assault. Ukraine is not striking randomly. Ukraine is methodically removing Russia's ability to perform the basic functions of sustained military operations, and doing it at ranges that, until recently, Russia considered entirely beyond Ukrainian reach. The strike on Shagel Airfield in Chelyabinsk deserves particular attention because it represents something that changes the calculus of this entire conflict. Chelyabinsk is approximately 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Su-57 and Su-34 aircraft, Russia's most advanced combat platforms, were struck on the ground at that distance. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 1,700 kilometers. When I commanded SEAL Team 3, when I planned operations as commander of JSOC, the concept of reach was everything. The ability to extend your operational influence beyond what your enemy believes is possible is one of the most powerful advantages any force can possess. Ukraine has now demonstrated reach of 1,700 kilometers using systems that cost a fraction of what they are destroying. A Kukurt-class missile vessel, capable of carrying Caliber cruise missiles, was struck at the port of Primorsk. Distance, which Russia had treated as a guaranteed shield, no longer functions as one. Every Russian asset, every depot, every airfield, every naval vessel within the vast geography of that country must now be considered potentially at risk. The strategic implications of that shift cannot be overstated. And here is what that means on a practical level for the commanders and logisticians trying to sustain operations in the South. Every convoy now requires escort and electronic warfare protection. Every fuel depot must be dispersed and concealed. Every ammunition storage site must be hardened or relocated. Every radar installation needs additional defensive coverage. All of this requires resources, personnel, equipment, fuel of its own, maintenance, planning hours, command attention. These are resources that are not being used to attack. They are being consumed purely to survive. This is the compounding math of sustained interdiction, and it is ruthless in its efficiency. Ukraine is spending thousands of dollars per drone strike. Russia is spending millions of dollars in defensive responses, rerouting costs, equipment replacement, and operational delays. The asymmetry always favors the side that can sustain it, and Ukraine has demonstrated it can sustain it. Now I want to talk about the Hornet drones because they represent something important about where this war is technologically headed and why Russian Z-bloggers are not simply panicking for show. The Hornet systems being employed by Ukrainian forces are penetrating deep behind front lines with a consistency and accuracy that Russia's electronic warfare systems are struggling to counter. Former Russian militant commander Igor Girkin, a man who has never been accused of underestimating military challenges, has publicly acknowledged that Russia cannot keep pace with this new generation of drone warfare. When your own hardline military commentators are saying your electronic warfare is inadequate, you are not dealing with a perception problem. You are dealing with a capability gap. And capability gaps in active combat do not close themselves. They widen. Every Russian fuel tanker burning on the T-0509 highway is not just a logistics loss. It is a data point confirming to Ukrainian planners that the system works, that the range is real, and that the campaign should continue and intensify. Let me tell you what the Azov Corps footage from around Mariupol tells me as a military professional, because it is one of the most operationally significant pieces of information to emerge from this front in months. Ukrainian drones are now patrolling roads approximately 160 kilometers behind the front lines. Attacks on Russian vehicles along the Mariupol-Donetsk highway have been verified through geolocation. That road was once Russia's most secure, most trafficked, most reliable supply route in the entire southern theater. It was the highway that made the land bridge possible in the first place. If Ukraine can maintain persistent drone presence and strike capability at that depth, 160 kilometers behind the contact line, then there is effectively no safe logistics corridor remaining between Russia's territorial border and its frontline positions in the south. Not the M14, not the TO509, not the roads around Mariupol. And that changes everything about how this war can be fought and how long Russia can sustain it. But here is what I want you to understand about the human dimension of all this, because strategy is not just maps and logistics tonnage and strike coordinates. Strategy is human beings under pressure, making decisions that determine whether they live or die, whether their mission succeeds or fails, whether their country survives. The Ukrainian soldiers who walked 10 to 20 kilometers on foot to reach frontline positions because their vehicles were too large, too loud, too visible to drone surveillance. Those soldiers represent something that no weapon system can manufacture. They represent will. Disciplined, focused, mission-oriented will. The counterattack and then the retreat, which their commanders described as just as deadly as the advance. That is not a comfortable war. That is not a war being fought from a position of material comfort or technological superiority across every domain. That is a war being fought by people who have decided that what they are defending is worth the cost of defending it. And that decision, made individually and collectively by hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian service members, is the foundation upon which every tactical and operational success is built. Russia's rushed redeployment of VDV forces from Donetsk to Zaporizhzhia tells you everything you need to know about how Moscow perceives the threat. The Kremlin is making the calculation that protecting the land bridge to Crimea is worth slowing its primary offensive toward Pokrovsk. Think about what that decision reveals. Russia's main offensive, the effort it has staked its entire 2025-2026 campaign on, is being deliberately deprioritized in order to defend a supply corridor that was supposed to be secure. You do not strip resources from your main effort to defend your rear unless your rear is genuinely threatened. You do not redeploy elite airborne forces from an active offensive front unless the alternative is worse. Russia is not making these moves from a position of strength. It is making them from a position of compounding constraint. And every redeployment creates a new vulnerability somewhere else along a front that stretches nearly 1,000 kilometers. The political dimension of all this is something I want to address directly because it connects everything happening on the battlefield to the larger question of how this war ends. Putin's recent rhetorical shifts toward discussions of peace are not occurring in a vacuum. They are occurring simultaneously with slowing battlefield momentum, escalating deep strike attacks on Russian territory and occupied regions, growing logistical pressure on the land bridge, and an internal information environment in Russia that even the Kremlin's most loyal propagandists are struggling to manage. Russian social media is not a free press, but it is a pressure gauge, and right now that gauge is showing elevated readings. Discussions about the Crimean corridor being threatened are spreading. The narrative that everything is under control, the narrative that Putin has maintained since February 2022, is experiencing friction against a reality that is increasingly difficult to curate. Combined with war fatigue, economic pressure from sustained sanctions and oil infrastructure strikes, and the ever-present fear of additional mobilization rounds, this information environment represents a genuinely dangerous domestic political condition for the regime. And this is precisely why the strategic logic that retired U.S. General Ben Hodges has been articulating is so important to understand. The three-phase model he has advocated, isolation, making the situation untenable, and ultimate liberation, is not a theoretical framework. It is a description of what is already happening. Ukraine is not attempting a frontal assault on Crimea. A frontal assault on Crimea would be costly in ways that are difficult to justify and would carry escalation risks that responsible leadership cannot ignore. But logistical isolation is different. Logistical isolation is slow, methodical, and in the long run, decisive. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed in its May 9th assessment that Ukrainian forces are striking effectively 100 kilometers deep into areas where Russia had previously conducted logistics operations with complete impunity. The Atlantic Council's analysts have echoed the same conclusion. You do not need to storm a fortress if you can shut off its water, its food, and its ammunition. Time and mathematics will do the rest. Consider the economic dimension, because wars are ultimately won or lost on economic sustainability as much as military capability. Russia's military presence in Crimea is expensive in ways that were manageable when the peninsula felt secure. Air defense systems require constant maintenance and ammunition replenishment. Naval forces at Sevastopol require fuel, parts, and personnel. Ground troops require everything an army requires, multiplied by the isolation of a peninsula that now has only degraded land access and a single bridge as its connection to the Russian mainland. Every drone strike increases these costs. Damaged equipment must be replaced or repaired at prices inflated by sanctions and supply chain disruption. Alternative routes cost more in time, fuel, and protective resources than the direct routes they replace. Ukraine is imposing costs of millions of dollars on Russian operations using systems that cost thousands of dollars each. That is not just asymmetric warfare. That is an economic siege conducted with precision weapons, and it is gradually pushing the cost of holding Crimea toward a level that even Russia's wartime economy will struggle to sustain indefinitely. The water situation on the peninsula adds another layer of pressure that tends to get overlooked in purely military analysis. The 800,000 Russian citizens relocated to Crimea since 2014 are living in a security environment that has fundamentally changed. Air defense is being eroded, tested, and in some cases penetrated. The sense that the peninsula is a safe part of Russia, a vacation destination, a symbol of national pride and recovery, is increasingly difficult to maintain when train stations are being struck and S-400 systems are being destroyed. Perception is not separate from strategic reality. It is part of it. And the perception among Crimea's population and among the Russian public watching from the mainland is shifting in ways that matter to the regime's political calculus. I want to close with something that goes beyond this particular front, beyond this particular conflict, because there is a lesson here that applies to every leader, every strategist, every person who has ever been responsible for achieving an objective under conditions of severe adversity. What Ukraine is demonstrating in Zaporizhzhia, along the M14, at Djangoi, and in the skies over Chelyabinsk, is that strategic patience, combined with operational creativity, is more powerful than raw mass. Russia has more tanks. Russia has more artillery. Russia has a larger population and a larger industrial base. And yet Ukraine, by identifying the critical nodes, maintaining operational security of extraordinary discipline, deploying asymmetric capabilities with precision and persistence, and refusing to accept the narrative that the stronger force must inevitably prevail, is changing the strategic reality of this war, one targeted strike at a time.